On May 21st, 1924, two young men, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, executed a cold and calculated plan to commit what they called the perfect crime. Their victim was Bobby Franks, a 14-year-old boy and distant relative of Loeb. Here's how it unfolded. Leopold and Loeb spent weeks meticulously planning every detail. They rented a car under a false name, scouted remote locations, and crafted a fake ransom note to mislead authorities. On the day of the murder, they drove through the streets of Chicago, searching for a suitable victim. Bobby Franks was walking home from school when they spotted him. Loeb, who knew Bobby personally, called out to him, offering a ride. Bobby hesitated, but eventually got into the car. Once inside, the plan took its horrifying turn. As Leopold drove, Loeb, seated in the back seat, struck Bobby on the head with a chisel, killing him almost instantly. They then drove to a remote area near Wolf Lake, where they stripped the boy's body, poured acid on his face and genitals to obscure identification, and stuffed him into a culvert. With chilling detachment, they returned to Chicago and mailed the ransom note to Bobby's family, confident in their intellectual superiority and ability to evade capture. But their perfect crime unraveled quickly. A pair of eyeglasses found near Bobby's body was traced back to Leopold, and under questioning, the young men's alibis collapsed. Their confession shocked the nation, not only for the crime's brutality, but for its apparent lack of motive. Why would two wealthy, intelligent young men commit such a heinous act? To answer that, we must delve into their minds and their twisted interpretation of philosophy. Let's start with Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's philosophy, especially his concept of the Übermensch or Overman, played a significant role in shaping Leopold's and Loeb's worldview. Nietzsche's Übermensch is a figure who transcends conventional morality, creating their own values rather than adhering to societal norms. For Nietzsche, traditional morality, rooted in religion and societal expectations, was a construct for the weak. He challenged humanity to overcome these limits and strive for greatness, to live beyond the herd mentality. Leopold, in particular, was deeply influenced by Nietzsche. He saw himself as a superior being, an Übermensch. In his mind, the murder of Bobby Franks was not a crime, but an assertion of his intellectual and moral superiority. But here's the catch. Nietzsche's Übermensch isn't about mindless domination or cruelty. It's about creating new values and rising above petty desires, not sinking into them. Leopold and Loeb's interpretation of Nietzsche was not only a distortion, but a profound misreading, a justification for their egos rather than a philosophical pursuit. Adding to this dynamic was the complex relationship between the two. Leopold was infatuated with Loeb, and their partnership often mirrored Nietzsche's concept of the master-slave morality, though in a distorted way. Loeb, charming and dominant, played the role of the master, while Leopold, eager to please and submissive, acted as the slave. This psychological dynamic further fueled their actions, with Leopold willing to do anything to gain Loeb's approval, even commit murder. Their bond was not just intellectual but deeply personal, with some evidence suggesting a sexual relationship between the two. Leopold later admitted that his devotion to Loeb was a driving force behind his participation in the crime. Leopold once declared, "A man of superhuman intellect can't be bound by the rules of ordinary men." This statement highlights the warped lens through which he and Loeb viewed Nietzsche's ideas. For them, the Übermensch was an excuse to indulge in their darkest impulses, rather than an aspiration to a higher, more noble existence. Now let's turn to Fyodor Dostoevsky. If Nietzsche represents the rejection of traditional morality, Dostoevsky is its defense. In his novel Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky explores the mind of Raskolnikov, a young man who commits murder under the belief that he is extraordinary, someone above moral laws. Sounds familiar? Raskolnikov rationalizes his crime as a utilitarian act, believing that by eliminating a worthless individual, he could do a greater good for society. But Dostoevsky does not let him get away with his reasoning. The novel is a psychological and spiritual descent, showing how guilt, alienation, and the inescapable weight of moral law torment Raskolnikov. It's Dostoevsky's profound argument that no one, not even the so-called extraordinary, can escape the human need for moral accountability. The Leopold and Loeb case also saw psychiatric experts brought into the courtroom who offered Freudian interpretations of their behavior. Psychologists testified that Loeb's thrill-seeking and need for dominance exemplified the unchecked id, primal and impulsive. Leopold, on the other hand, was described as having a distorted ego, suppressing his moral conscience and rationalizing the crime to fulfill Loeb's desires. These testimonies painted a picture of a toxic dynamic where each fueled the other's worst tendencies, providing a psychological lens through which the jury could understand their actions. In the Leopold and Loeb case, we see the collision of these philosophical and psychological works. Like Raskolnikov, Leopold and Loeb believed they were beyond conventional morality. They saw themselves as superior, exempt from the laws that govern ordinary people. But unlike Raskolnikov, they showed little remorse, at least initially. Their trial became a stage not only for legal arguments but for philosophical and psychological debates. The defense attorney, Clarence Darrow, famously argued that they were products of their environment and influences, emphasizing determinism over free will. He didn't mention Nietzsche or Dostoevsky explicitly, but their shadows loomed large. The murder shocked American society to its core. The brutality and apparent lack of remorse from Leopold and Loeb were seen as emblematic of moral decay among the privileged elite. Newspapers ran sensational headlines calling them thrill killers and questioning how such intelligent, well off young men could commit such a heinous act. Public opinion was divided. Many demanded the death penalty, arguing that their wealth and education made their crime even more reprehensible. Others, influenced by Darrow's arguments, saw them as victims of flawed upbringing and dangerous ideas. Darrow famously stated, "I am pleading for life, understanding, and compassion." He emphasized the young men's lack of emotional development and how their environment fostered their delusions. His arguments were instrumental in sparing them from execution. But what happened to Leopold and Loeb after their arrest and trial? Despite public outcry for the death penalty, Clarence Darrow's impassioned plea spared their lives. Darrow argued that executing the young men would be a futile act of vengeance and emphasized the role of societal and psychological influences on shaping their actions. The judge sentenced them to life imprisonment for the murder and 99 years for the kidnapping. Loeb's time in prison was cut short. He was murdered by a fellow inmate in 1936 during an altercation. Leopold, on the other hand, spent over 3 decades in prison. He dedicated his time to education and reform, even writing a book about his experiences. In 1958, Leopold was paroled and he spent the rest of his life in Puerto Rico, working as a medical technician and living far from the public eye. He died in 1971. So what can we learn from this? Nietzsche and Dostoevsky weren't just offering abstract theories. They were grappling with the core of human existence: freedom, morality, and the consequences of our choices. Leopold and Loeb's actions reveal the dangers of misinterpreting or misapplying philosophical ideas. Nietzsche's call to rise above mediocrity was not an invitation to murder, and Dostoevsky's exploration of guilt reminds us that no one escapes the moral weight of their actions. In the end, the Leopold and Loeb case isn't just a story of a crime. It's a cautionary tale about philosophy's power and its perils. When ideas are twisted to justify cruelty, they lose their meaning and their humanity. And perhaps that's Dostoevsky's final lesson. The true measure of greatness isn't in rising above morality, but embracing it, in all its complexity and weights.